The silent scenery of Buckingham Palace reflected the white hues of winter as the sky gradually turned a heavy gray. Crowds of tourists came and went, a few phones raised to capture each moment of this legendary visit. But amidst the stillness, a sweet vape cloud hovered, breaking the icy air of London and drawing the confident strides of three teenagers into the scene. Jackson was the first, walking like a star in a music video, wearing a designer knockoff jacket slung carelessly over his shoulders, with a vape in hand. He took a long drag, releasing a thin cloud of smoke that seemed to float like delicate clouds, causing a few people to furrow their brows. That smoke not only obscured the air, but also acted as his self-assured shield, as if everything in the world had to follow Jackson's gaze. Right behind him was Dylan, the loyal but slightly less confident best friend. His cargo pants hung too low, almost to his ankles, and his hands often made gangster gestures, though they appeared far from cool. Despite that, Dylan always stood behind Jackson, always trying to keep up and please the friend he admired. Finally, there was Ben, walking with awkward hands stuffed into his oversized hoodie. The smallest in the group, he didn't truly fit into the world Jackson and Dylan had created. Ben wasn't fond of their antics, but he was too afraid to be left out. He glanced around at the tourists watching them with curiosity, but Ben was too scared to speak up. Jackson stopped, his eyes scanning a row of royal guards standing solemnly in front of the palace. He smiled, realizing this was the perfect moment for a new joke. "Yo, guys, check this out. Doesn't he look like a clown at Christmas?" Jackson yelled, causing the crowd around them to pause and focus on his words. Laughter spread quickly, but Ben, standing slightly behind, felt something catch in his throat. He wasn't happy seeing others record the moment, nor was he pleased to be part of the joke. Though Ben didn't say a word, a heavy feeling filled his chest, as if he were deceiving himself, turning himself into a part of a game he didn't truly understand. The surrounding laughter made him feel more isolated. He wanted to stop, but feared that Jackson and Dylan would see him as weak. So he stayed silent, blending into the laughter, even though deep inside, Ben didn't feel happy at all. The loud laughter still echoed in the air, as if everything around was just a performance by those who were indifferent. Jackson stood there, his gaze still full of self-satisfaction, looking around as though he was commanding the entire square. He knew that he was the center of attention, and nothing could change that. Yet, in those moments, the feeling of victory swept through his mind as swiftly as a gust of wind, leaving Jackson feeling a little uneasy. He turned to look at Dylan and Ben, then raised his head high, as if signaling for them to continue joining in the prank. Dylan began stepping forward, stretching as if to assert himself. Each of his steps carried a slight hesitation, but when he met Jackson's expectant gaze, all the self-doubt vanished. He imitated the accent of the British aristocracy, flashed a cheeky smile, and said with a sarcastic tone, "Oh, truly a royal tea party, isn't it, everyone?" The crowd burst into laughter again, with some even pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Dylan felt as if he had conquered the world, and the encouragement from the crowd made him want to keep going. But there was one thing Dylan didn't realize, which was that inside, he wasn't completely at ease. His mocking words may have made Jackson and those around him laugh, but he felt a strange emptiness, something he couldn't quite identify. Every time he looked at the guard, a peculiar sensation rose within him, a feeling he couldn't name. Yet, that confusion was quickly buried under a shell of self-satisfaction. The only thing that mattered now was how to continue attracting attention. Ben stood behind them, his eyes wandering aimlessly. He had never liked these pranks, but he was too afraid of being seen as an outsider. He just wanted to fit in with his friends, just didn't want to feel lost in this life. But every time he looked at the guard, a sense of emptiness rose inside him. He didn't feel joy in witnessing this prank, yet he didn't dare to speak out. He didn't want to upset Jackson, whom he had always seen as a role model, a leader. He didn't want to be seen as weak. But deep down, Ben knew this wasn't right. He just couldn't understand why he felt so uneasy. "Ben, don't you see? Look at his face. He's definitely thinking we're a bunch of idiots." Dylan laughed, waving his hand as if urging Ben to join in the fun. But Ben just looked down at the ground, silent, his mind in a muddle. He didn't know how to respond. Zane, noticing this, shot a disdainful glance at Ben. He felt frustrated that Ben wasn't participating in his prank. He had poured all his energy into creating a spectacle to draw the square's attention. Yet Ben remained silent. At that moment, Jackson felt the need to intensify the drama of the game. He looked at the guard, as if challenging his silence. "All right then, let me see how much longer he can stand still," Jackson said, laughing as he approached the guard, making a mocking comment to challenge him. "Yo, you must be tired, right? Come on, can you smile a little? Or are you just going to stand there like a tree?" Jackson said while waving his vape in front of the guard, as if trying to provoke him. The crowd around them began to laugh loudly, but Ben just stood there, watching Jackson's every movement, feeling the tension rise inside him. The guard remained motionless, with no expression changing on his face. But in that silence, something made Ben feel a chill down his spine. His feeling was like being trapped in a world where everything seemed upside down, and he couldn't do anything to change it. Then a sigh slipped from Ben's lips, involuntarily. Jackson and Dylan didn't notice Ben. They continued joking around, continuing to challenge the guard. But one thing Jackson couldn't see: Ben was standing alone in the storm of confusion and self-doubt. While everyone continued to laugh, Ben felt an indescribable pain, a sense of being lost and lonely. "Keep going," Ben whispered, unheard by anyone. "Everything has gone too far." The atmosphere in the square had shifted. The crowd had not completely stopped, but the laughter had become hesitant, as if something invisible was hanging in the air. Eyes no longer focused on the prank of the three teenagers. Instead, they slowly began to turn toward the guard soldier. He stood there, like a living statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead, unchanged, but it was this stillness that thickened the air and made it tense. Jackson, still standing there with the vape in his hand, continued to release puffs of smoke, but there was an unease within him that he did not recognize. Although he tried to maintain an air of self-satisfaction, the discomfort had lingered in his mind for the past few minutes, as if this challenge had gone too far. Jackson looked up, scanned the surroundings, and noticed that the gazes were beginning to change. He looked at the crowd and realized not everyone found the joke amusing anymore. The coldness in their stares made him feel like an animal in the forest, being hunted. But Jackson couldn't stop. He couldn't lose. A part of him told him that if he stopped, he would no longer be Jackson, just an ordinary boy with nothing special. "Dylan, don't you see? He's getting angry," Jackson said, trying to laugh to break the tension. But when he looked into the guard's cold eyes, he felt something strange. It was no longer a simple challenge, but a warning. Dylan, too, wasn't feeling comfortable. Though he tried to appear strong, he sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He looked around and saw a few disapproving glances from the crowd. A cold breeze passed by, as if the people around them were beginning to realize the joke was no longer funny. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his confidence. "Yo, don't worry, this guy's not going to do anything. A challenge like this is what makes it fun." Dylan laughed, but his smile seemed forced. Deep inside, he felt uneasy. He wouldn't admit it, but things were slowly slipping beyond his control. But Ben, standing alone in the back, began to feel he could no longer watch. He looked at Jackson, then at Dylan, and finally at the guard. A part of Ben wanted to stop. He didn't want to do anything anymore, didn't want to continue with this prank. But another part feared that if he stopped, everyone would think he was weak, a coward unable to stand with his friends. This feeling of insecurity weighed heavily on his heart, making each step feel like it was bound. Ben took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Guys, we should stop," he said quietly, but loud enough for those around him to hear. Jackson's gaze immediately swept over him, the contempt in his eyes obvious. What are you saying? Are you scared?" Jackson sneered, while Dylan looked at Ben with disappointment. The feeling of being out of place took hold of Ben once more, but this time, he couldn't turn back. He had stepped up, and now, he couldn't retreat. "Come on, don't you see this is going too far?" Ben tried to speak again, but his voice seemed lost in the unnatural silence that enveloped the square. A terrifying silence. Jackson looked at Ben, then at the guard. His sense of superiority began to waver. He looked at the crowd again, and their cold stares were like sharp knives piercing his heart. But he couldn't give up. Jackson wanted to prove that he wasn't afraid, that he could do anything without worrying about what others thought. He took a long drag from the vape and took another step forward, close to the soldier. "You think you can just stand there forever?" Jackson said with a mocking tone, but this time, the tension in his voice could not be concealed. The guard did not move. He stood upright, his face expressionless, but Ben could feel the change in the air. The entire crowd fell silent. All the laughter had vanished, leaving only tension, like a stretched rope ready to snap. A sound rang out like something shattering. It was the sound of Jackson dropping his vape to the ground. He stood still, his eyes wide, staring at the guard, but there was clear panic in them. His look was no longer full of self-satisfaction but fear, as if he realized he had gone too far. But before he could react, the guard turned, his eyes flashing like sparks. "You've tested my patience for far too long." The soldier's voice came out, cold as ice. "Now, I will show you what real discipline is." His words rang like thunder in the clear sky, powerful and commanding, making everyone fall silent, even Jackson. The atmosphere in the square was no longer the same as before. All sounds had ceased, leaving only a heavy silence, dense as if time itself had stopped. The crowd had taken a step back, creating an invisible distance that formed an unfamiliar circle between the three teenagers and the soldier. Jackson still stood there, eyes wide open, staring at the soldier. The smugness and arrogance that had previously defined him were now replaced by a vague sense of fear. He knew he had gone too far, but a part of him still didn't want to stop. He couldn't stand still, couldn't lose face in front of the crowd, couldn't let anyone see his weakness. Dylan, standing beside Jackson, seemed to have noticed the shift in the atmosphere. Though he still tried to appear cool, a quiet fear was rising within him. He looked around, realizing that the crowd's gazes were no longer encouraging. They were looking at him as if he were an outsider, a troublemaker in a sacred space that he didn't fully understand. But Dylan couldn't admit it. He couldn't allow himself to seem weak in front of his friends. He could only continue participating, despite the growing unease in his heart. "Keep going, don't mind them," Jackson whispered, but his voice lacked the strength it had before. His eyes remained fixed on the soldier. The coldness in the soldier's gaze was a warning, and now, each passing second felt like a battle between the instinct to preserve his pride and the slow spread of fear within him. But Ben, standing behind, could no longer bear it. The tension, the confusion in his heart was growing stronger. He couldn't stand by and ignore it any longer. The guilt and remorse gnawed at him from within. He felt as if he had been complicit in this disrespect, and it made his heart ache. Ben should have stopped it from the start. He should have told Jackson that this wasn't right. But he hadn't dared. And now, everything had gone too far. He felt like he couldn't go back. "Enough, guys. Stop it." Ben spoke up, this time not an apology, but a shout that pierced the stillness, full of effort and desperation. "We've done enough. Don't push it further. What can he do to us?" "He won't do anything." He stopped, his eyes cast down, his voice choked in his throat. Jackson turned to look at Ben, disbelief clear in his eyes. "What did you say?" Jackson's question felt like a slap to Ben, making him feel more lost and smaller than ever. Jackson didn't want to understand. He just wanted to end the game by pushing the soldier's patience to the limit. But something had changed in the soldier's eyes. The silence was gone. No longer was there an emotionless gaze. Instead, there was an underlying tension, as if he was preparing to do something not just to these three teenagers, but to the entire crowd. In a split second, Ben noticed the difference in the soldier's movement. He slightly shifted his posture, eyes still fixed ahead, but his grip tightened on his long rifle. Ben's heart tightened. He realized this was no longer a joke. Jackson looked at the soldier, stepped forward once more, and said in a challenging tone, "What do you think you can do to us? You're just a guard standing at the gate." The words echoed in the silence, but as soon as they left his mouth, Jackson felt the mistake. The soldier's eyes were not just cold, but also held a sternness, like a storm waiting to erupt. The soldier didn't speak. He simply turned his gaze back to the three teenagers. Then, a sound echoed, powerful and authoritative, like a thunderclap shaking the space. "You have tested my patience for too long." His voice rang out with authority and severity, making everyone's heart stop. "It is time for you to pay for this disrespect." Before anyone could understand what was happening, the soldier moved swiftly, his steps precise and almost unimaginable. Jackson looked at him, eyes wide open, a part of him still wanting to resist, but another part starting to tremble. He couldn't push himself out of this situation. He felt like he was stuck between two worlds, a world of pride and one he couldn't control. 3 seconds. The soldier's voice was low, each word like a fatal blow. 1, 2, 3. When the count reached 3, Jackson hadn't reacted yet, and Ben, in overwhelming fear, weakly cried out, "Mom!" He couldn't hold it back anymore. All images of pride, of friendship, vanished in an instant. The feeling of regret, fear, and helplessness surged within Ben. He couldn't do anything, couldn't turn back, couldn't stop crying. All that remained was the destruction of his pride and the cost of his defiance. Everything in the square had settled down now, with only the heavy breaths of the three teenagers, the soft footsteps of the guard, and a stifling atmosphere remaining, as if every living creature knew that a change had occurred. The crowd no longer laughed, no longer filmed videos. An absolute silence enveloped the place, every gaze carrying a new perspective, a way of looking at the values they had once taken for granted. Ben, standing at the back, was still crying. His tears were not just from fear, but from shame and regret. He looked at Jackson, looked at Dylan, and then back at the soldier. In his heart, a feeling of disappointment rose like crashing waves. What they had just done was not only a lack of respect for a guard, but also an offense against the long-standing values of the country: respect, discipline, and patience. What he felt now was a late regret, but also a lesson he never thought he would learn in this way. Dylan, though not crying, had a clear look of confusion on his face. He looked down at the ground, feeling as though he had just lost a part of himself. A part of him wanted to maintain his cool image in front of his friends, but another part of him realized that the joke was not worth it. He never thought that such a small action could bring such a big consequence. He felt like he was falling apart, like a broken piece that could never fit back together. Ben's words still echoed in his head. "We've gone too far." And now, they felt like a sharp blade cutting into his heart. He didn't know what to do, only standing there, watching the disaster he had helped create. Jackson, at this moment, no longer had any smugness or confidence. He crouched down on the ground, his head lowered, his hands trembling, not knowing what to do. All the cool images he had created, every confident step, had vanished, leaving nothing but a sense of total helplessness. Not only had he been reprimanded by the guard, but his own self-respect had also pushed him into a pit. He had tried to show he was the leader, that he was fearless, but now he was just a weak, ashamed person. The price he had to pay was not just the loss of his image, but a costly lesson about never crossing the line of respect and discipline. But then, something strange happened. The guard said nothing more, simply standing still, his eyes still fixed ahead. A gentle breeze passed, making his uniform flutter, but he remained there, without a single expression, only the stillness of thousands of hours of training, of centuries of discipline. His gaze was no longer threatening, but resolute, as if he had proven everything that needed proving. No words were needed. The silence spoke everything. He didn't need to do anything more, just standing firm was enough. The crowd, which had initially shown signs of displeasure, now looked at him with admiration. Their eyes now gleamed in a different way, not admiring the mischief of the three teenagers anymore, but respecting someone who had held steadfast to his traditions, no matter the challenge. Every gaze was turned toward the guard, who had shown them a lesson in strength not from violence, but from patience, from stillness, from standing firm in one's values. Ben started to stand up, quickly wiping away his tears. He didn't know what to say, but in his heart, he knew that this was the moment to change, the moment to realize that respect was not just a simple act, but a way of life, the maintenance of principles even under pressure. Dylan also stood up, looking at Jackson with an understanding gaze. He didn't know what comforting words could do, but at least he understood that they had gone through a bigger lesson than anything he had ever imagined. Jackson, finally, stood up, bowing his head toward the guard, saying nothing, but in his eyes, something had changed. It wasn't smugness, it wasn't arrogance, but a deep understanding, a respect he had never felt before. He knew that, whether he liked it or not, he and his friends had learned this lesson in the most unexpected way. And from that moment on, when the three teenagers walked away, no one saw their arrogance anymore. They were no longer the children seeking attention, but the ones who had learned that respect and discipline were never weaknesses, but the true strength.